Great, well thanks everyone for showing up and finding us on the fourth floor. Hopefully we'll have a few more people trickling in as we get going here. And yeah, I'm going to keep a short introduction today. My name is Greg Stiegel. I'm the Operations Director for Renewable Energy Alaska Project. Welcome to the second installment of our speaker series. Yeah, for any newcomers, REAP is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in town here, and we work on advocacy and education to advance renewable energy in the state. I'm going to kind of leave our organization intro at that because I think Chris is going to get into some of that stuff in his little presentation. And yeah, part of our outreach effort is putting on these events. And we're so happy to be able to provide them free of charge, and we couldn't do that without our sponsors. So just want to take a quick second to thank our sponsors for supporting us. We have two leading sponsors, BP and the Municipality of Anchorage Solid Waste Services. And our supporting sponsors are the Denali Commission, Doyon, Chugach Electric Association, CIRI, the Alaska Center, and the Anchorage Museum is an in-kind sponsor for us. We had our first event 2 weeks ago on electric vehicles, which was a great turnout. And just a quick rundown of our upcoming events. On November 5th, we'll be in Fairbanks, and we'll be talking about paths to cleaner, more affordable, and resilient electricity. We'll be live streaming that event, so if you can't make it up there, keep an eye out for our website and Facebook page if you want to check that one out. November 7th, we'll be back here on the fourth floor in the museum talking about the Railbelt electric grid. And then November 21st, we'll be talking about tidal energy. We'll have an update from Levi Kilcher of NREL and an ORPC representative to give an update on what they got going on in the state. Now on to tonight's event. To thank our panelists for being here. We've got a great lineup. REAP has worked with ACEP for many years and has been excited to work with Launch Alaska as they've been kicking off. And there's kind of a natural coalescence of our three organizations working together. So yeah, the point of this event here is to kind of highlight the work that each of these organizations are doing individually and how they have come together and are working to advance clean energy in Alaska. So yeah, we're going to hear a short presentation from each panelist with a little slideshow, and then they're going to dive into a conversation together, sort of interviewing each other, and then we'll open it up to some question and answer at the end of the evening. So yeah, just short introduction for each one. We've got Chris Rose, the founder and executive director of Renewable Energy Alaska Project, Isaac Vanderberg, who is the CEO of Launch Alaska, and Gwen Holdman, who is the founder and director of the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, which is part of UAF. So I think I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Chris to kick it off.
So I think a lot of folks know who REAP is and what we do, but I'm going to give you a little bit of context for the discussion tonight, and that is about building a clean energy economy in the state of Alaska. That's something that a lot of jurisdictions around the country, around the world are talking about, and the three organizations that you see represented up here on the stage are among several other organizations that are working together to actually figure out how to do that. Okay, I'm going to just kind of focus on the last part, our mission. So our mission is simply to increase the production of renewable energy and promote energy efficiency in the state through 4 different means: collaboration, education, training, and advocacy. And I'm going to really focus a lot on the education and the training because that's kind of our role in this, this partnership that we have with Launch and ACEP and others. Obviously, it's very difficult to have a clean energy economy if you don't have people who are trained and educated to take care of this equipment and who are also part of the group that may be doing research and development. But we have to build career paths for these kids. And so a large part of what we're doing is K-12 education. Colleen Fisk, our education director, is here in the front, and she works with like 3 other folks here on the REAP staff that are really focused simply on K-12 education, training opportunities, and pulling together the university workforce development and the K-12 sector so that those sectors start to know who else is in it, and how they can work together. So that's a big part of what we're doing in this partnership that we're talking about tonight. This is part of the why. So why should we be caring about this? This Monday, just a couple days ago, the International Energy Agency reported in their latest 2018 report, they're expecting that clean energy worldwide is going to expand by 50% in the next 5 years. So that's part of what's going on here, is that we've got this huge expansion of clean energy. It's policy driven in many ways, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But this is happening, so the question is Alaska going to be part of it or not? Or is America going to be part of it? We're all going to, I think, ultimately be big consumers of clean energy products and services. The question is, will we also be ones who are actually providing them? And that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of the work we're doing together. And the agency also noted that the challenges that remain are policy and regulatory uncertainty, high investment risk, and system integration of wind and solar. And I thought this was a great quote to frame the conversation tonight, because in large part, one of the things that REAP is doing in this partnership is focusing on that policy uncertainty. One of the things that Launch is doing is focusing on that investment risk, and one of the things that ACEP is doing is focusing on how to integrate wind and solar and the technical aspects and the R&D for that. So this is part of the reason why we're doing all this. Energy policy, again, is one of the things that I focus on, and these are different drivers. Whether we like it or not, these things are happening. Technology is innovating, and we are going to have to find ways to fit that into the policy that we have. Fuel price volatility is here to stay. When we're talking about fossil fuels, for instance, here in Alaska, we may be producers of oil and gas, but we get no hometown discount at all. In fact, the utilities here in the railbed are paying almost 3 times what utilities in the lower 48 pay for natural gas as feedstock, almost 3 times. Yet we're developing it right here offshore. Changing consumer preferences is definitely making a dent in policy, because people are just deciding they want clean energy, particularly when it comes to industry. And you look at Facebook and Google and all those folks, they're saying we want 100% renewable electricity. Grid resiliency and security, that's really come up a lot lately in the sense of what's happening in California. Right now, I think 170,000 people have just been turned off. Last week it was more than that, and there were a lot of vulnerable people and communities that were left discussing it with each other, going, well, why are we on this grid anyway? Maybe we should have a microgrid. Maybe we should have a smaller grid that's more local, more resilient, and so on. But there's a lot of security risks worldwide that are being addressed through this policy. And last, climate change writ large. I mean, climate change is driving this. So again, one of the things that we try to focus on is the policy, and we don't have one in the state. We have programs that have been really helpful, but we do not have any domestic energy policy in the state of Alaska. That is a policy that is focused on how Alaskans are going to produce and consume energy. This is just a quick slide to show how quickly, well, this doesn't show how quickly, but just how cheap renewable energy is now. I left out some other slides that showed the trajectory of how quickly clean energy has changed in price over the last decade or so. But if you look at this slide, you'll see that, and I'm not sure if this works or not, land-based wind here is between 2.9 and 5.6 cents a kilowatt hour, and solar is not that far behind. If you already have fully depreciated nuclear or coal, it might be in that range. But right now, basically, land-based wind is the cheapest electricity you can produce on the planet. And that's only going to get cheaper depending on the jurisdiction you're in, and solar is following it. So again, this is happening. How is Alaska going to respond to it? This is just this is a reminder that Alaska also has a lot of opportunities in the energy efficiency space. We are estimating that we are literally wasting about $1 billion worth of energy a year in Alaska collectively when we look at the amount of energy that we're using for transportation, heating, and electricity. We're probably wasting 20% of the $5 billion that we're collectively spending on energy every year. So That's $1 billion we could be keeping in our economy, and there's a lot of investments that we could be making, a lot of jobs that we could be creating to get there. So Arctic, that's what we're calling this partnership. Alaska Regional Collaboration for Technology Innovation and Commercialization. The Office of Naval Research is supporting all of our organizations to get this done, and Arctic is kind of a funny acronym that I have to actually read because I can't remember what it means. But the idea is we're working together because we have different skill sets and niches. And here you can see the rest of the Arctic partners. Besides the three of us, also at the university is the UAA Business Enterprise Institute, and then up at UAF, the Office of Intellectual Property, and Center ICE. So that's who we are. We have 3 organizations here tonight to talk about it, and I'll turn it over to Isaac.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks also to REAP for putting this event on and for hosting us, inviting us, and this is a great series. And also, from Launch Alaska's perspective, this kind of partnership is perfect because if you look at the companies that we're working with, the challenges that they're facing are really policy and regulatory challenges. Like, we're doing a good job of finding them opportunities and finding companies that have technologies that are ready to go and have good business models. But at the end of the day, the thing that is keeping, from our perspective, this from really catching fire in Alaska is getting that policy and regulatory environment going. And so this partnership with REAP is tremendously valuable and is actually critical to our organization's future success. The other thing, Launch Alaska, many of our companies currently come from outside the state, something that we really want to change, and in order for that to change, we need the university to be playing an outsized role in creating talent and in capturing some of the research, the great research that they're already doing, and commercializing it and putting it into an entrepreneurial firms that folks that come through our accelerator are ready to go, and that they're kind of ready for prime time. And so working with Gwen and all the work that she's doing, just heroic work at the university, is perfect because we need that pipeline of talent and companies starting to be spun out of the local kind of technical world. So Launch Alaska's mission is accelerating the resource revolution. What the heck does that mean? To us, that means that we are decarbonizing and electrifying food, water, transportation, and energy systems. This kind of transition, this energy transition that's underway is being driven by all sorts of things, fundamental economics. These, decarbonized technologies are now cost competitive, even though renewables don't receive subsidies the way that other, carbon-based fuel systems do, they're still cost competitive. So the technology is there, society, corporate procurement. There's all these great global vectors that are spurring on the kind of decarbonization of these energy systems. And so what we're trying to do is we think that the solutions to decarbonize and electrify food, water, transportation, energy, many of those are largely there, like the ones we need for the next 20 years are largely there. And so how do we deploy those and get those out in the field, get those tested? And our view, based off of work that, kind of foundations that Chris and Gwen have laid, our view is that Alaska can be this world-class deployment ground for those solutions that are ready to go. If we can bring these amazing companies to partner up with our local utilities and our municipalities, our native corporations, our communities, that they can validate their tech, they can validate their business model, they can get some revenue, they can show that it can make it through a whole winter and the kids, boom, shoot holes in the solar panels, which is an actual challenge. And that from there, they could go from here to much larger markets. So Alaska should be this, Gwen talks about the Iceland model. We know Iceland has done geothermal. We can be that for kind of technologies in food, transportation, energy. And so our program is one where we bring in all of these exciting companies. We recruit globally. So if you look at the folks who came in through our last program, actually I'm going backwards. We get together, we first ask a bunch of really smart people in Alaska what their challenges and what their problems are. So people like are on the screen behind me. Folks from ASAP, and we talked to Chris, and folks at REAP. We talked to the utilities, we talked to some of the corporates, and asked them what kind of problems that they see that exist in Alaska. We try to take that problem set and compare it to some exciting global markets, and then we recruit companies with solutions for those problems. And then the people behind me, we bring them up for a day of basically speed dating at the museum, and they bump into all of these companies that we've asked to come up. The companies are coming to Alaska not because we're really good looking or we're so fancy. It's because, and they don't come for the money, but what they're coming for is an opportunity to actually deploy their tech in a real world setting, show that it works, and they go from here to larger markets. And so these companies, I'm kind of doing this backwards, which I'm just going to go with it here. I'm going to come back to that slide. So the event that we had this last year was the beginning of our 2019 program, and we had all these amazing companies coming up. It runs the gamut from Proterra, which is kind of the company that doesn't look like anyone else up there. It's the world's largest manufacturer of electric buses, and they've got 500 employees, and they're adding 100 more. They're a little different than the rest of the companies up there. So, many of the other companies are very small, like average 5 employees. But it runs the gamut, from some folks that are trying to create hydrogen using different methods. There's a group that has a little pigeon that reads a meter and reads a water meter and sends it back to the water utility, and that company just cracks me up. The whole pigeon thing just is hilarious to me, but it's a really neat technology. Another company, a group that has sensors that helps fishermen recover tackle, which is a multi-billion-dollar problem every year, the lost tackle in the fishing industry. So they have this sensor so that you can go and recover that tackle. Really interesting group of companies. And I think we had 28 sign up, of which 2 were from Alaska, or 3 were from Alaska this year. And we spent a day at here at the museum downstairs, and we took, we had a speed dating session in the morning, and in the afternoon we had, each company did like a 15-minute pitch, and we did kind of like a Shark Tank thing. And then at the end of that day, the panelist, who you saw on the previous page, if the panelist stood up and said, yes, this belongs in Alaska, this solves one of our problems, we have a bead on an actual project or an opportunity for this company to deploy, then that's the company's ticket to come back 8 weeks later, and we do that 4 times. And with 8 weeks between each session, so it's an eight-week program, and then by the time we're done, we think there will be 4 to 10 companies left standing, and we actually make a little investment in the company at that point, and we try to get them to grow and actually deploy in Alaska. I'm going to go back one slide here. Cut me off, Greg. I kind of black out when I'm presenting, so I don't know if I've gone on for an hour already, or 5 minutes. Okay, thanks. And so this is just a breakdown of where the companies are coming from. You can see, 11 or 12%, I think, was the statistic this year from 22% international, about 16% from Alaska, 60% from the lower 48. You can see the breakdown. This was the first year where we did food, water, and transportation. We've always been really focused on energy. And so now, for the first time, we added these other verticals, and we had a few applicants there. So just kind of interesting to see where folks are coming from. And the good news is that we get more applicants every year. For the last 3 years, we've had better applicants, better quality, and we're getting, out of the 13 companies that we've invested in right here, they're all still alive. 5 of them actually have revenue in the state, and they're all growing in value. We had one company that the founder was actually killed in a car accident, which is a terrible story this last year. But other than that, all of the companies are alive and going, and many of these companies are now, Box Power has hired someone in Alaska. Signal is wanting to incorporate in Alaska, and they're looking for investments. We're hooking them up with Alaska investors, and they want to open up an office here. And so, we're taking the long view, but if you look at accelerators globally, about half of the companies that go through an accelerator end up relocating to the community where the accelerator is. So our hope is that over the next 10 years, we get more companies coming in. We also have some of the companies that come through our program, like, meet people here, use our trail system, like fall in love with people. Like that's actually, we're kind of like a dating component to what we're doing. That is what keeps these companies in the States. I just wanted to real quickly, a really interesting company that I think does a nice job of illustrating what we're trying to do is a group called Box Power that came to us. They have this 20-foot Connex container with a 50 kilowatt solar array and a battery bank and like a diesel backup generator. It's an interesting company because their technology, there's not anything actually there's no like special sauce there. There's no like IP that they have created that's so advanced. What they're doing is basically just taking components that exist, combining it in a way that makes sense based on the needs of people in rural communities. And it's a business model innovation and a kind of assembly of different parts in a way that is rugged and works in Alaska. So they delivered a few units out to Buckland last year, ran them through the winter, they survived, they performed well. The community of Deering has now ordered a few more, so they delivered 3 more. Meanwhile, as Chris was talking about earlier, the incredible fires and the stuff that's going on with PGE in California, all of a sudden, now that they've done a few deployments in Alaska and they can actually point to these things working, their order list, people are calling them up and being like, screw this, we want to get off the grid. Can we get one of your units at our school, at our campus throughout California? So all of a sudden, whereas these 6 units that they delivered were 95% of their sales funnel, now all of a sudden, because they've demonstrated that, they're getting this massive push, and they've hired Alaskans, and they would love to, they also have plans to do a lot of stuff in the NANA region next year. It's just a really exciting story that just brings it all together, and NANA has, interacted with the REAP team and ASAP, and we've all, we're all kind of wrapping our arms around this company. But we have several success stories like that are just like, like this stuff works. The theory behind what we're trying to do actually seems to be panning out. So anyhow, stay tuned. Hopefully we can get more of these companies that were up here in 2019 to do actual projects, and we can tell their success stories in coming years as well. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lynn Holman.
So I guess what I thought I would start out in talking a little bit about is like, why would the Navy have interest in Alaska? Obviously, DoD is a major player up here in the state. We have deep roots and deep relationships with the defense industry or defense, especially the Air Force and the Army. The Navy has not been as big of a player in Alaska. But there are these really interesting ties, because I think that's one of the things that we asked too when we first started this partnership with the Office of Naval Research is, how are the things that we're doing in Alaska actually relevant to what you're doing? And one of the ways that it is relevant is that there are a lot of analogies between the way that we produce and deliver power here in Alaska and needs for remote deployment sites around the world and around the globe, especially when we have a kind of a challenging and a lot of unknowns in terms of geopolitics internationally. And so the Arctic is of interest to them broadly, but also some of the ways that we're actually doing things innovatively and differently here in Alaska. And I don't think that we think about those sorts of things a lot. But a big piece of it is really the fact that because we have such a large geography here, such a big state, such a big place with so few people, we have to find creative ways to make sure that we can provide communities with resilient and reliable power. So when you look at like PG&E and the situation in California with the wildfires, where there's a lot of uncertainty about delivery of electric power services to certain customers there. We've dealt with those sorts of things in Alaska over time for different reasons. Some of that is due to natural disaster challenges, but a lot of it is also just because of the fact that it is a large geography, and we have vulnerabilities in terms of lack of redundancy in a lot of our infrastructure. So microgrids is one example of that. So I just kind of give this small definition of what a microgrid is, which is essentially whether it's maybe a naval ship that basically is sort of an island of power, an island of how they're producing and using electric power and power for propulsion, and within a shipboard system or in a remote community in Alaska. That's another example of that. Now, I would like to also argue, though, and this is, I'll just show this graph really quickly. This is data from a company called Navigant Research. And so, Alaska is a pretty small place when you look at the population, but when you look at the installed capacity of microgrids in Alaska, we're #1 in the country. And when you look globally, we actually have about 12% of the installed systems around the world, and this isn't based on our data, this is based on data from Navigant Research, and that's not just on the number of installed systems, but the actual installed capacity of those systems, which I think is pretty interesting. And when you look at some of the other states that kind of pop up on here, there are a lot of states that that have had challenges related to reliable and resilient power systems, a lot of them because they have suffered from challenges related to natural disasters historically. And so they've been investing in this kind of microgrid, this sort of reinventing the way we're delivering power to our customers. Now, in Alaska, there are these remote communities, and there are clearly these microgrids, these little islands of electric power. However, our rail belt system actually is very much also just a series or a network of individual microgrids that are nested or linked or interconnected. And a lot of people would argue that this is actually the way our electric infrastructure at the national level is going to be developed out in the future, that we're sort of evolving toward not so much sort of a centralized delivery of power with one directional, delivery to customers that are sometimes far away from a central power plant facility, but much more sort of bi-directional delivery of energy where producers or customers are also producing some of their own electric power, putting that back on the grid, where you've got these kind of resilient sort of areas that can disconnect from the grid when there's some sort of disruption of power. So that's where someone like Fox Power comes in to sort of develop those sorts of services and provide that opportunity for reliable power even in the face of some sort of challenge to the grid as a whole. So this is for Alaska. I'll just take Fairbanks as an example here. We've got the UAF grid. That's an individual microgrid that typically generates its own power. It's mostly providing heat for the campus, and then the electric power is essentially almost a byproduct. You've got the bases in Fairbanks, and then the Fairbanks grid as a whole can isolate or island from Anchorage for whatever reason that might be necessary. There's some vulnerabilities in that transmission line, and there's also times where Anchorage decides they have some disruptions to power supply down here, and Fairbanks gets cut off first. But anyway, we have a large battery system that's been operating to kind of support that northern end of the rail belt intertie system. And when this was installed, it was one of the largest battery systems in the world. And so these are examples of how Alaska has been sort of pioneering technologies and solutions for a really long time. We just haven't thought about it that way because it's just the way that we're delivering power and kind of solving our own challenges in Alaska. So when we look at these sorts of areas where we're incorporating renewable resources, Alaska has a very high proportion of communities that have over 10% total contribution of renewables to their grid, and a lot of those include variable resources which are harder to incorporate at high levels. And there's a lot of places in Alaska where we're pushing above 100% penetration of wind energy in particular at any one point in time, which is much more than most utilities would accept. And we're doing that because we have the resource availability and because we're trying to displace imported fossil fuels, and our utilities are willing to accept more risk often than utilities in other places. This is a view of the circumpolar Arctic, and so this challenge around remoteness and high cost of energy that creates an opportunity to think of novel solutions and to do things that are cost effective at today's price points in these remote areas. This is a challenge all around the Arctic. So you can kind of see in this image the gray area, sort of the edge of the northern edge of sort of the North American electric grid, or the continental electric grids on both continents. And beyond that, about 20% of the landmass in the entire world, which is part of this northern or Arctic region, is not grid connected. You know, you either have something like the rail belt grid, which in itself is not connected to Canada or to the rest of the United States, so we're sort of this isolated regional grid, or you have all these dots here that represent remote communities across the Arctic region that are mostly reliant on fossil fuels and importing those fuels. So there's some really interesting innovations happening in the Arctic. We just don't often think of the Arctic as a region. And a lot of these regional grids, like the rail belt, or our grid in Southeast Alaska, or Iceland, which I would also consider to be a regional grid, they actually have a very high proportion of renewables that are connected to them. Iceland's sort of a poster child of renewable energy development in many ways between their hydro and their geothermal resources. But there's a lot of pretty innovative things happening in the Arctic, and Alaska is not lagging in this area. And I think that what I'm interested in seeing is how we can convert some of the innovation that's happening in the Arctic into really more entrepreneurship, so that we can get more companies with some of the ideas that are being pioneered here in Alaska to be participating in Launch Alaska, and ultimately trying to capture what I view as like a larger global market for some of these strategies and technologies. So, I mean, I'll just give like one example. This is a small community that I view as kind of like a leader in this sort of transition to clean energy, Kongiganak. They have a system that was developed by an Alaska company, Intelligent Energy Systems, and they got to 65% displaced fuel, including 7 days straight where they were running with their diesels turned off last January, which is really quite advanced, you know. And this is these are things that are happening here in Alaska today. You mentioned the communities of Buckland and Deering. I think they've both operated now with their diesels turned off for periods of time. These are sort of like really, this is sort of the next generation. This is where people are trying to move the technology to, and Alaska's really been leading the way in many ways. So our role at the university, I'm going to keep this a little bit short, but we were formed 10 years ago, 11 years ago maybe now, really with the goal of trying to help Alaskans address the energy challenges that they're facing. And so really looking at very applied research that's directly meeting the needs of Alaska's utilities, our communities, and our industries in trying to find ways to reduce their energy costs and improve their processes related to energy management. And so, so we're based at UAF, but we also have an office here in Anchorage on the UAA campus. Actually, one of our researchers, Chris Pike, who works in our solar program, is here. Chris, if you don't mind. So if you have any Anchorage-based questions, you can ask Chris about that. But anyway, yeah, or ice cream. But anyway, yeah, so basically we also operate a lab, and so one of the things that we learned is that we want to kind of minimize failures in the field in Alaska. So wherever possible, we want things to fail in sort of controlled environment before we send them out into the field, because we've had a lot of failures in places in Alaska in the past, and we want to try to minimize that. So we've developed a laboratory up in Fairbanks that mimics or emulates one of these microgrids at full power levels, around the size of a community like Kongiganak, for example. So we operate this lab, reduce the problems in the field. We're also really looking at how we can use this as a training resource, and this is kind of where we're working with REAP, for example, on things like that, and figuring out how we can really push the envelope and how we can start to look at what the next generation, what the new evolution of technology is, and working with the companies in Launch Alaska to try to make sure that their technology is hardened in ways that it's ready to actually send out into the field. And so just, I put this example in, it's just one of many, but this is a flywheel that we tested and integrated with an inverter package, and then sent it out into a remote mine in the Canadian Arctic. I kind of use this example because we work pretty internationally. ASAP, our program, and a lot of actually organizations in Alaska have an international footprint, and so I think that that's one thing that we're trying to continue to leverage and build on. And so this system was installed at a mine in northern Quebec, and that's an example of an environment where you really cannot accept any sort of failure. You couldn't have a wind system or a flywheel, in this case, disrupt power flow to a mine. And so you want to make sure that any failures that you see, and we did experience some failures, is going to happen in the lab. We're able to test things in the same sorts of environmental conditions that you might see in the field, and then we can make sure that we reduce the risk to the end user. So that's the kind of thing that we do. And I just kind of want to highlight that I really believe that Alaskans are doing amazing things. I am inspired by people here in the state every day. And this is kind of where I think that we need to leverage the expertise, the experience we have here, work to continue to build that through training of our youth, education of our youth, and then figure out a way where we can really try to leverage the experience and know-how that we've developed from our own systems to try to deal with some of these challenges at the more international and global level. So how can we learn from what's happening internationally, but how can Alaskans also be part of global solutions in this space? So, and that's it.
Well, I'm going to kick off the questioning here of each other by maybe asking Gwen to follow up on the last things you talked about, and maybe perhaps talk about an example of one or two companies or ideas that are out there for Alaskans and Alaskans' expertise to help people outside. Not technology necessarily, but maybe service industry and so on. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about Alaskan expertise being exported around the world, and maybe talk a little bit about the possibility for that.
Yeah, so one thing that we've been doing is we've been working with a number of different, especially Alaskan, both utilities, but some of the companies that we have active in this space. The people that have this really deep know-how on how to actually make these systems function in these remote areas often are part of nonprofit organizations. You know, a lot of our utilities in the state are cooperatives or municipally owned utilities, and there's really not a profit motive. There's not very many IOU kind of utilities in the state. And so they often come up with a really good idea on how to solve a problem, but there's not necessarily really some kind of a motivation for them to convert that into some sort of intellectual property that they might be able to patent or spin into a product or a company or something like that. And so what we've been doing is we've been forming a group called the Alaska Microgrid Group, with the goal of kind of pooling some of the most talented Alaskans in this space, and then finding ways that we can more actively get involved in projects in other markets. And so one example of that right now is in Nunavut, in the Canadian Arctic. They are very interested in developing wind energy. Both Nunavut and Greenland are interested in expanding wind energy technologies, and they're quite interested in bringing Alaskans in. So it's a question of how can the Alaskans that have the most knowledge and know-how about developing these systems actually actively participate in projects in other markets in ways that works with their kind of their day job, I guess we could say, back here in Alaska. So that's something that we've been working on pretty actively. And another place is also in Iceland, frankly. They have done a very good job on renewables. They're probably one of the top in the world, but they have one remote community that's similar kind of thing like in Alaska. It's easy to run diesels. There's a reason why these communities are on diesels, because diesel fuel is a really good storage mechanism. It's pretty, you know, it's a way that you can store energy and access it when you need it. And so we're working with them to see how lessons learned from Alaska might be applied for this particular community in Iceland as well. And so anyone that's interested in potentially being part of this, we'd be interested in chatting with you, because I think there's a lot of potential there.
Thanks, Gwen. I'm going to ask Isaac a question too, and then maybe you guys can ask me or each other some questions, and we'll get to audience participation in a second. But there's also been a lot more talk recently about this concept of beneficial electrification, which is essentially replacing fossil fuels, not just in the power sector, but also in the transportation and the heating sector with renewables. So the idea of not just looking at electricity, but where are we getting our heating fuel, where are we getting our transportation fuel? And Isaac, you talked about how Launch's mission, I think, is really broader than just energy, even talking about water and food systems. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about some of the companies that you have had experience with, or some of the problems that you have seen in the midst of the work in addressing the food security issues that we may have here in the state, or even water.
Sure. And so, yeah, you know, from our perspective, the generation side of all of this stuff is being sorted out by, you know, there's some big players that are putting out solar and wind, and even in the battery space, and I think there's some like really big players in that space, and it's going to be sorted out kind of by who wins the, you know, the RFPs, these big RFPs that utilities are putting out, and there's a bunch of folks that have battery technology and solar and wind now, and there's this churn going on where I think like the natural cycle is that in the next 5 years, a few of those companies will win, and those will be the big suppliers, and kind of wind and solar and batteries will become kind of like a commodity, and it'll be a race to the bottom. And from a startup perspective, there are some very niche applications that like that we're still interested in terms of like companies that are producing any kind of generation technology, like maybe someone that can have a wind turbine that survives out in the Aleutians would be a real niche that we're still excited about. Or one of the companies in our portfolio is Oklo, which is a company that has been working with ACEP and is a small micro reactor that's a fascinating technology that is actually going to have an unveiling on November 7th in DC here. And like, you know, their long-term plan is to have energy that's at fractions of a penny, you know, per kilowatt hour. So that's a game-changing technology that we're interested in also. But really, the stuff that I'm more excited about these days is not so much just the generation side, because that seems to be like the EIA, you know, study that you had. EIA is already saying it's going to be 50%, and EIA, if you look at what they've done in the past, have actually underestimated how quickly renewables are going to be taken over. They get a lot of criticism for being too conservative, so I think it's going to even happen faster than what EIA is saying it's going to happen at. But all these other technologies that are enabling this resource revolution to happen are really exciting, and things like firms that have you know, augmented reality applications, so that, you know, utility managers can go in and you know, they can wear a piece of goggles that tells them exactly how to go in and manage the equipment. You know, some of the blockchain stuff is a space that's really exciting, where, you know, markets in the lower 48, and the conversation is kind of starting up here, where you know, people can trade electrons between their electric vehicle and the utility, you know, and that and different parts of the grid, and they can establish like a real-time market using blockchain technology and do this peer-to-peer energy transacting. Like, this is where the world is going, and there are firms working on this stuff, and a lot of those technologies are really exciting. And also, the reason that, you know, we focus on the food, water, transportation, energy is because if you solve some of these problems, like if you solve the peer-to-peer energy transaction thing, you're also solving a big problem for our ability to deploy EVs at scale, because, you know, utilities are scratching their heads right now trying to figure out what the business case is around EVs, and how do you value a battery that pulls up to your grid and tries to charge, and what's the value stack there? Like, what does the vehicle owner pay for? What does the utility pay for? Who makes the money? Blockchain starts to answer some of those issues. That's like an energy transportation nexus thing. If you're trying to solve a lot of the food resilience and food security issues, you're oftentimes having to solve energy issues, and you're having to solve transportation issues. So all this stuff, it's all tied together, which is, you know, this nexus that people talk about between food, water, transportation, and energy. The companies that we're working with, oftentimes, so it was interesting, in our most recent event that we ran, we started out by separating the companies into a food track, a water track, a transportation track, and an energy track, and then we tried to select panelists, because we're like, hey, you're an energy panelist, you're a food panelist, you're a water panelist. And it really quickly came back to us, and people were like, I know I'm from a utility, you know, I'm at MEA, Julie Estey, but we're really looking at the food industry and the growing industry, you know, all kinds of growing, and we're looking at EVs, and so I don't want to just be in energy, I want to be in transportation, I want to be in food, I want to be in water, because this is all part of what our utility is talking about. Or we'd have someone that's in the ocean, we thought they were a water person, and they're like, no, we don't want to just be ocean, we want to know what kind of renewable, what the trends are in renewables and in energy and in food, and you know, so all this stuff is all converging, and many of the companies that we're working with like are aware of that, they get that they're operating in this space where everything is kind of converging under one umbrella, yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question. What should we do next?
I have a question for Chris.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Chris, because you know, one of the things that I was speaking or communicating with somebody that's developed projects in Alaska, renewable energy projects, and one of the things is that, you know, we've built a lot of systems over the last decade. A lot of those were benefited by the Renewable Energy Grant Fund, which you had a pretty big hand in developing through REAP. I am curious to know what your thoughts are in terms of long-term kind of operation and maintenance challenges and how we make sure that these systems continue to operate in the future. Like, to what extent is that a training question? To what extent is there, you know, costs associated with that? How do we make sure that these systems that we're investing in are actually going to serve the sorts of functions that we expect them to over the kinds of timelines that we hope that they can do that?
That's a great question, because when you put in a renewable energy project next to, let's say, a diesel system, it's going to last for 20, 25 years. And over that time, not only are you going to have to operate and maintain it, but there's probably going to be some opportunities to optimize it, because there'll be other technologies that come in, like new battery storage or new control systems. And if you don't have somebody in the community or looking out for the community who is trained to recognize those opportunities, then you may miss an opportunity to optimize the system. But just bare bones, you have to operate and maintain it correctly, as you said. And the renewable energy projects that have been built so far through the state funding have somewhat of a range of performance that I think we can in some way attribute to some of them being operated and maintained a little bit better. We have a lot of communities here in the state that are remote and don't have a ton of human capacity in that community. And that's contrasted with, let's say, Alaska Village Electric Co-op, which runs 58 of our remote community utility grids. And so AVEC has this economies of scale where they can develop human capacity and perhaps trade people, some of their staff around the whole state and move them around kind of a circuit rider type model. A small community doesn't have that opportunity. If a small community has a project, then it's likely that they either have to have somebody who's in that community, living in that community, who's trained to take care of that project, or somehow work some arrangement with another community that will be able to share some of that expertise and training. The folks in Kong, you put a picture up there of the folks in Kongaganak, are an interesting case because Kong is part of a relatively loose-knit group of communities that's called the Shininikwin Group. So it's not just Kong, but it's Kong, Quig, Kipnuk, Tutuliak, and maybe one other Chifornak, I think. Those five communities work together to do training. They work together to install the wind turbines. They work together when they need to work together. And I think that's the kind of smaller scale, not an AVEC scale, but a smaller scale association of communities that we have been looking at as potential models. There's also a huge opportunity, I think, to work with local native corporations, because most of the corporations also have a nonprofit arm. So for instance, right now, we're working with folks in the Bristol Bay region, not just BBNC, but also BBNA, and looking at the opportunities for developing more of a local, regional training not just center, but training opportunities for people who live in those regions. Because it is crucial. If we don't have our operations and maintenance down, then you can put the best technology in the world and you may not have the success that you're looking for. So that's it's a real key for us, and one of the things that we launched a couple of years ago, again with Office of Naval Research funding, is something called the Alaska Network for Energy Education and Employment, or ANE. And our ANE director, Chris McConnell's not here tonight, but the whole idea behind ANE was actually hatched with Gwen and others. We were talking about this 8 or 9 years ago because we kept reacting to all these education and training opportunities that were out there. And one day we just sat down and said, hey, if we were going to be proactive and we were going to create something and develop something in the state for energy education and training, what would it look like? And the ANE model kind of was born out of that. And the whole idea is we know that there are a lot of K-12 teachers out there who are enthusiastic about clean energy. They may not know each other. This is a big state. We know there's a lot of vocational and technical folks around the state who care about clean energy. Again, they may not know each other. They may not know what's going on 500, 600 miles away. And even we know there's a lot of great people at the university level who are interested in working with the clean energy industry. But again, they may not know each other. So the whole idea of ANE is to build sub-networks with K-12, Voctech, and university in an umbrella network so that we can, into the future, both build energy literacy here in the state and develop career paths for young people.
I'm curious, and I want to hear also if there's folks in the audience that have questions. I think we're going to leave some time at the end for that. I'm curious, both from Gwen and Chris, two folks that I have admired for years and have been kind of watching their organizations as they grow. Can you articulate, I'm going to put you on the spot, but can you articulate, like, what is the vision for Alaska, like, 2050? If everything we're doing, we're wildly successful, beyond our wildest dreams, like, take it to its logical end, what does Alaska look like? Can you paint your kind of vision of what the state looks like at that point?
So let's see, so we're talking about 30 years from now.
You're good at math, you're an engineer.
And I think like one of the things that I think about a lot, we had this little bit of a sidebar conversation earlier today, is, I've got kids right now. They're in 4th and 6th grade up in Fairbanks. And I think a lot about them. I've been trying to brainwash them to convince them that they're going to live in Alaska for the rest of their lives. So I've convinced them that Alaska is the best place in the world, right? But in 30 years from now, they're probably going to have their own kids, right? And so really thinking about what their lives, if they do choose to stay in Alaska and raise their kids, my grandkids, here someday, what is it going to look like here, And what I really, what at the end of the day I really think about is sort of a really bright future for our youth, And I think that energy, food, transportation, all this stuff sort of fits into that. How can we become a more kind of self-sufficient and self-reliant society here in Alaska? We've been very dependent on a single industry. We're very reliant on federal resources here, and I would like to see us do more in terms of supporting local agriculture, small businesses, local energy resources, where we are playing our role in sort of where I think that we need to transition to as a global society, but also really doing that in a way that connects our youth to global opportunities, so that I would like my kids to believe that they can stay in Alaska and be part of like a super, interesting business, startup business maybe, that's really connecting what we're doing here locally to global challenges, whether that's in energy or tech or whatever that looks like, but they can do that from here in Alaska and still kind of benefit from the amazing resources and land and beauty that we have here and live here, but be part of global solutions. And that's what I really care about. So really thinking about how we can kind of transition our society away from the kinds of reliances that we have now. And I also know the average, I heard somewhere that the median number of years that someone spends in Alaska is 7 years. And that's really scary, right? Because this is where we are not making investments here in the same kind of way that, say, Icelanders are. Okay, you brought up Iceland first, so it's not. In Iceland, you know, people, they grow up there, they might leave, they go for an education, but their, you know, parents and grandparents are there. They often go back to raise their kids because it's a great place to raise, you know, children. And so they're willing to think about and invest their resources in ways that's pretty different than I think the way that we think about investing our resources here, you know. I work at the university, and it was pretty shocking to me to see that we were willing as a state to let our state university declare financial exigency. Right, like that's not valuing an investment in the future. I worry about our education system here. I worry about where we're investing and where we're choosing to put resources, and that's kind of like what I'd like to see us think about is what resources, what infrastructure, what education system do we need to make sure people stay here beyond 7 years, and, you know, start to really think of Alaska as the place that they call home and that they're willing to invest in.
I love Gwen's vision. I'm just going to add a few things. To get all those things that you are hoping for, I think we have to have a really engaged populace, and that means people who are not only just voting every 4 years for president, but people who are voting in interim elections, people who are voting and running for local office, people who really take citizenship and democracy seriously, because I think part of the reason that we don't have the kinds of investments that you're talking about is that people are a little bit distanced from those decisions. And the way our society is set up, it's supposed to be, the decisions are supposed to be made by the majority, but if the majority is a really small slice of the actual absolute population, then we're actually getting a lot of decisions made in this society by a relatively small group of people. So I think part of the vision has to also be getting people engaged and excited about being part of politics. And politics is a dirty word for a lot of people, but it shouldn't be. I mean, politics is you know, what we actually go overseas to defend our, you know, we defended democracy around the world, we defend democracy here in the United States, and that's a political system. So I think we have to start to understand and teach children that that's a normal part of growing up too, is that you have to take some responsibility along with all the rights that we have in our society. So I love the vision that you're talking about, because I think Alaska is one of the most amazing places on earth. I moved here 30 years ago now because of the beauty, not because of a job or anything else. And I hope there's a lot of other people who want to live here for that reason. But we got to have more opportunity. We've got to have a diversified economy. And I also think that because of climate, we're going to get more people moving here, whether we may anticipate that or not. People are going to be figuring out what many of us have already figured out, which is it's not dark all the time, it's not cold all the time. There's a lot of really cool things to do here. And I think that there is an opportunity for us to attract more people here who are going to care about the future of this state. So we should get to Q&A from you folks. So I think we've got another half hour or so. We'd love to answer the questions that many of you may have. You want to pass this microphone around, Greg, if anyone has a question?
Hi. Tonight you've been talking about technology, and you've been talking about human capital as things that are promoting a clean energy economy in the state. But I'm curious what you think about to what extent federal policies, broadly considered, constitute a barrier to building a clean energy economy in the state. I probably, more than most people, except maybe Scott, spent time listening to hearings of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, chaired by our Senator Murkowski. And many of those hearings focus on barriers to innovation in energy presented by things like perverse incentives provided by the way that grids are regulated. Again, it's more of a problem in the lower 48 probably. Or what else was that? But, well, for instance, one of the biggest things is the multi-$100 billion per year subsidy that the fossil fuel industry has received through federal regulations and laws and policies. So, to what extent should we go away thinking that the future is bright and we just need to, keep teaching people in Alaska about clean energy and start and promoting innovation? Or to what extent do we need to focus on changing federal laws and regulations?
I'll take a first crack at that. I totally agree that there are a lot of barriers at the federal level because we don't have a federal energy policy either. And we do have a lot of perverse subsidies. On the other hand, a lot of the innovation in policy making has been happening at the state level for a long time, whether it's in energy or something else, and so I wouldn't want to only focus, and I know you're not saying that, but I wouldn't want to put too much focus on just the federal change, because the state has an opportunity to have, the state, even though we don't have an energy policy yet, has an opportunity to have a great energy policy. If you think about it, 730,000 people, we should be able to turn on a dime, relatively speaking. We don't have 40 million people like California that have to go through a political process to change their politics and to change their regulations, even though they're I think already headed in the right direction. So I still have a lot of faith, I think, that Alaskans can change relatively quickly, and I also think that the policy drivers that I mentioned earlier are not going away. They're only going to get bigger, and so I also think that more and more people are going to have to submit to new thinking and new ideas relatively quickly, and that's going to be happening both at the state and federal level.
So there was a fellow in town recently that is an investor, a private equity investor, that was looking at a couple of projects that one of our companies is doing, and those of us who have been here for a while were kind of managing expectations and saying like, oh, this thing is tough, like maybe we're a little jaded. And his perspective, which I thought was really interesting, was like, from an investment perspective, his view is if the economics are there and they're compelling enough, everything else will change behind it eventually. Maybe 2 years, and maybe 10 years. But like, invest in the fundamentals, the economics of these projects, and that will drive policy at some point. If you look at what's happening nationally, what's the latest? 12 states have now come out with 100% renewable targets. And some of those states, Texas, deep red state, is the largest penetration of wind in the country, that's driven, I think, largely because all of a sudden you don't have to convince people that to do this. Like the economics are there with these technologies. And so, like, I guess my optimistic, I'm probably overly optimistic about these things, but my view is that like it's going to happen not at all, but then all at once. And because the fundamentals are so compelling that it's no longer, like renewables are no longer a toy and a science project of people that are smoking weed out in the Oregon wilderness. Like, this stuff is blue collar industry at scale, mini megawatt PPAs at 4 cents a kilowatt. I mean, like, this is blue collar middle America industry now. And as soon as that starts to happen, like, you're starting to see, kind of across the political spectrum, folks that are starting to come around to renewables because they just see the job opportunity and they see the economic opportunity. And as soon as you get kind of the political right wrapping their arms around this, it's going to happen all at once. I know it's chaos right now on the federal level, but I think there's some really interesting things that are starting to happen from my perspective. So, one thing that I really hope for on a federal level is that, the PTC for wind and solar, the production tax credit and investment tax credit for wind and solar, which are all of a sudden being talked about possibly being extended. I really hope that there's a storage production tax credit and a storage investment tax credit. I think that would be super helpful because wind and solar are kind of there now, And what we need is to kind of unlock deployment and storage at a federal level. So and I think that's starting to, there's some conversation at the federal level about getting that kind of a tax credit for storage. So I'd be excited about that, if that could come together.
Policies do impact us here in Alaska. I mean, there's some, obvious examples. You mentioned the production and the investment tax credits. Kind of the up and down roller coaster of that doesn't just affect Alaska, but sort of the uncertainty, the uncertain business environment that sort of creates is a negative all around. That sort of like lack of having a long-term energy policy or vision that creates certainty for businesses in terms of making investments is sort of a challenge. Things like the EPA and looking at like Tier 4 emissions requirements for diesel generators in rural Alaska. The fact that we've had some recent wins in that area actually for getting exemptions for Alaska utilities in rural Alaska. That's a good thing, I think. But in large part, I think Alaska kind of marches to a slightly different drummer. We're sometimes out of sync of what's happening at the national level. Like one thing is, when you look at the federal level or at the national level, like looking at the coal industry, right? How many new coal power plants were built in the United States last year? One. Does anyone know where it was? Fairbanks, Alaska, right? That was the only new coal-fired power plant in Alaska last year, and that wasn't really a policy reason, that was purely economics, right? And it was economics for why it was built in Fairbanks, for that matter, right? Because it was primarily a heat plant using a local resource. We don't have natural gas available locally in Fairbanks. As a way to heat the campus there. So, there's ways I think that Alaska, and Chris mentioned that states are often sort of incubators for innovative policy. I really very much believe that Alaska could be that as well, and that's what I would like to see. I'd like to see us be creative and innovative in thinking through policy solutions, technical solutions, and business solutions to kind of move ourselves forward. And because we are a small society, I totally agree that we can do things quickly should we decide that is what we want to have happen.
So I have a couple comments, but one follow-up on what you were just saying. In terms of the business aspects of alternative energy, this summer saw a huge increase in local solar in Anchorage through the Alaska Centers initiative. And to me, that's a national policy affecting local businesses. And unfortunately, the credit that got a lot of us to buy our systems this year and increase those companies' revenues for the whole year is decreasing over time and then goes away. And so these businesses are basing their model on their customers' overall economic situations and seeing if 30% on that cost is going to help them or not. And do you guys see any, kind of national movement to continue those credits at that higher level? Because it does impact local businesses in probably every state. And then there was a statistic, this is a question too, statistic about energy being, renewable energy being produced in Alaska. And have you looked into how much more has been brought online because of the tax credits this particular year? Because these guys were so busy. I mean, I started my system in May, and I just started generating a couple weeks ago, but part of that was MLP's fault, so I won't go into that. And that's a training issue. Maybe that's what you need to.
The investment tax credit you're talking about is one of the tax credits, along with the production tax credit that Isaac just alluded to. That there is now some renewed discussion in Congress about extending, and I don't know whether that'll happen or not. It is, in my opinion, unfair that renewables have such a small percentage of federal energy subsidies relative to fossil fuels. But in general, you do want subsidies to end over time. In general, you do see that you know, the whole idea behind them is that you get a industry off the ground and then it becomes self-sustaining and then it moves on without the subsidies. And at some point the renewable energy industry has to, you know, say, you know, we're good. And the wind industry in particular was saying that 4 years ago when they negotiated the end of these tax credits in Congress. There was a negotiated end to that. Whether or not we'll see a reopening of those negotiations or not, I don't know. But the cost of solar is going to continue to go down. Tariffs aside, they may or may not impact the cost to consumers in the short term, but the cost of solar panels will continue to go down. So even if the investment tax credit goes down, hopefully people will still see that it's of value. The other issue that's much more local that I think impacts people's willingness to purchase a solar system is their ability to net meter with the local utilities. And there's also right now a discussion about increasing that cap that the Regulatory Commission put on net metering when they developed that administrative rule 10 years ago. They said that the utilities only had to net meter up to 1.5% of their load, and a few of the utilities are already getting close to that. Homer Electric's just announced that they're willing unilaterally increase that to 3%, so we're hoping that the other utilities will do that as well. In the big scheme of things though, the production tax credit, which supports commercial utility scale renewables, is probably putting more renewable electricity on the grid than the investment tax credit that helps rooftop solar.
What do you see as sort of projects that are ripe, clean energy projects in Alaska, and what sort of likely funding sources for those?
Do you mean like commercial utility scale projects?
That, or just in general?
Well, rooftop solar is going to continue to be attractive for a lot of people. And that's going to be distributed energy on people's homes and businesses. From a utility scale, we talked a little bit about the microgrids and what's going on. In rural Alaska, there's going to be more, I think, communities that are going to be trying to increase the contribution of renewables like wind and solar, and battery storage is going to play a big part of that. On the grid here, I would suggest considering coming back for our November 7th discussion, because we're going to be talking about some of the barriers to putting more renewables on the grid here in the rail belt, which are largely due to the fact that we don't have a regional system. We don't have regional interconnection system. We don't have promulgated standards for regional reliability yet. We don't have regional planning. We don't have a regional transmission tariff. And all those things are making it very difficult for renewable projects, or frankly any independent power producers, to get into this grid and to compete in the grid. So REAP is really focused a lot now on electric grid reform as a first step toward laying the table, if you will, setting the table for more renewable projects to come in, whether this be wind, large-scale wind, or possibly, in the future, we hope tidal technology will be past emerging and be commercial. And there's also the possibility, for instance, a geothermal project at Mount Spur, who knows? But there's opportunities out there that are not going to probably be invested in by the private sector at all until the grid issues that I just mentioned are resolved.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I was just up in Canada a couple weeks ago. Alaska has a pretty nice sovereign wealth fund of 52 billion, 54 billion, something like that. Canada's sovereign wealth fund, the one that's based out of kind of the Montreal region, is a $450 billion sovereign wealth fund. On their homepage, right on the front and center, it says we've joined with 5 of the other world's largest sovereign wealth funds to invest over 1.3 trillion over the next couple of years in solutions to climate change. That's a big, there's a lot of zeros on that. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that in the venture capital space, if you go to some of these VC conferences now, everything is ESG, 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 ESG. Like that's all that people are talking about, which is environmental, social governance. And these are the big VC funds. These are like the ones that have been around for 20 years. They're the people who are putting their, like the generational wealth who's putting the money into those VC funds. They're now starting to be pushed to invest in, in technologies and companies that are taking the environmental side and the social side and the governance side really seriously. So VCs is another source of money. Foundations, a lot of these foundations that have been over the course of a couple of decades looking at investing using grant-making mechanisms, so putting out $500,000 to help some nonprofit get up and running with zero plans for any kind of return off that. A lot of those foundations are now going, can we take that grant-making money and instead turn it into impact investing, where we earn back 1 or 2%. But now we're telling our investors that we're investing in climate, and there is so much money available. This has been a large part of kind of our life, or my life over the last few months, because we have companies that have solutions. We have people in Alaska who have said we're dying of energy costs, and we have needs. Like what is the disconnect here? Why, if the solutions are there, if we have a bunch of money, people are willing to spend money on that. If we have people that have shown needs, why are we not seeing more projects get done? And I think that, policy is a part of that. I also think it's just getting projects packaged and getting people together to do the kind of unsexy work of taking an entire utility and saying, like, let's have a vision for what your utility is going to do over the next 20 years. Let's create a roadmap, and then let's start creating public-private partnerships to get this done. I think that's a big part of the work that all of us are going to be needing to do over the next 20 years. It's like that project packaging. The problem is not lack of money that's available. The problem is lack of velocity of projects. People that are out there that are just packaging those projects and floating them up so that we can have public-private partnerships. The other obvious one that I think is willing to play, and there's a lot of work from within DoD and across the federal agencies, is they're starting to think about how can they leverage through public-private partnerships this private capital that's wanting to be spent on climate, and how can they start structuring, the capital stack so that the federal money takes maybe higher risk and goes in to do some of the project design and some initial engineering and the scoping of the project, and then you let private investors come in to put in money to help a project scale or to actually earn interest off of it. And so designing kind of the capital stack where you're including federal and you're including foundations and you're including some of the private investment, I think it's a huge opportunity. That is the problem that we need to be solving, because everything else is kind of ready to go. There's a little thing called the Green Bank too that I've heard about.
Well, I was just going to mention that what Isaac just described, when you design the financing stack, when you design a loan program that can address that, that is what a Green Bank does. In that is something that REAP is working to develop. That is something that other states are working to develop or have developed, and that's a way for a relatively small, modest amount of state or federal money to leverage a whole heck of a lot of private investment by de-risking the project for the private investors. So that's a big deal, I think, in terms of getting a lot of, especially small projects going. Because a lot of the bigger projects, they have sources of money. It's the small mom and pop projects and the energy efficiency projects that are going to really, I think, get a lot out of at a Green Bank if we can develop one here in the state.
I'll agree with that. Our big challenge here in Alaska is kind of scale of projects and high transaction costs, related to getting deals done. It doesn't help that we have over 100 certified utilities in Alaska. So, who do you work with? And if you get a deal done here, it doesn't necessarily translate to other markets, so in Alaska. So I think that that's kind of one of the big challenges we have, and if we can address some of those things through creative financing tools that we develop here in state, that helps. And we have done that in the past. That's really a big there was a big uptick in projects in the state 10 years ago was with the Renewable Energy Fund, but that hasn't really had any significant amounts of financing or funding that's been put into that in the last few years, and yet I actually would like to get some statistics on this, but I haven't necessarily observed that there's been a big slowdown in project development with that reduction in funding. I mean, there's still projects coming online, there's still things that are happening, despite the fact that that tool hasn't been part of the toolkit for many project developers or communities or utilities. There's still things happening. We're just getting creative and finding other ways to make projects work.
So a lot of this discussion so far has been about cost, and we've got some comments about regulatory circumstances or subsidies. But when it comes right down to cost, I think, Chris, you posted a really terrific nationwide average in the Lazard Asset Management's levelized cost of electricity graphic you posted. That's the cradle to grave cost of different sources of electricity as a nationwide average. Have you seen that for different regions of Alaska? And boy, if you haven't, that'd be fantastic for education purposes, because I've not seen that. I think it would be fantastic if you could at least comment on the rough costs or relative costs of diesel in remote Alaska versus wind.
I mean, our cheapest electric power in the state is from hydro resources, mostly in Southeast, that were funded with, some sort of state funding, decades ago, right? So we have communities in Alaska that are paying, 9 cents a kilowatt hour for power, and they use that electric power for space heating, for example, in some cases. So there's, in my opinion, little doubt that hydro in Alaska is probably, on average, the cheapest source of electric power for the communities that have it, especially storage hydro with a dam, basically, right? I mean, that's my observation. In terms of wind versus diesel, one of the things that we don't do a very good job of taking into account with all of this is really thinking about long-term price impacts, right? So one thing that utilities like about wind energy, especially in rural Alaska, is that there's a lot more certainty about the long-term costs associated with that. And there's quite a lot of value for them that's tied up in that. So if you kind of know approximately what you're going to be paying for that wind energy, which you're amortizing over the lifetime of that project, because the capital costs are really where most of the cost is, there's some real value in that, and it's hard to kind of quantify what that value is. But the cost of installing wind in Alaska is not the same as these large wind farms that we see in the rest of the country. I think that AVAC has estimated that they've, at least historically, paid, $10,000 a kilowatt for installed wind, which is very high. That's much higher than you would see at the national level. I think that the other thing is that a lot of the benefit, these are things that need to be really thought through. Subsidies, we've talked about, are a real disincentive for developing alternatives, whatever those subsidies are for. One of the reasons in Alaska that we've actually developed a lot more renewables than, say, in northern Canada is because our subsidies are actually relatively low. And for rural Alaska, those subsidies only are applied to residential customers, which is maybe about a third of the kilowatt hours that are sold in most communities, just kind of back of the envelope numbers. So 2/3 of the kilowatt hours sold for government users, a school, whatever, or commercial users like a fish processing facility, they pay the full cost of electric power. And in many communities, in a larger hub community, it might be somewhere between around 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And in a community where you're maybe flying fuel in, like Shungnak in the Nana region, it might be above $1 a kilowatt hour. for electric power. So there's like huge variance, but those places where the cost is very high, that really provides this opportunity to transition to renewables. Canada subsidizes more heavily, so you see less incentive to transition. And so it's kind of like an interesting dynamic. So if you talk to a utility like Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, they would say that they have seen reductions in the cost of electric power for commercial and government users that are paying the full amount of power. But for residential users that are actually getting the subsidy, the benefit actually goes back to the state, which is kind of an interesting thing, and the residential users don't see any reduction in their rate. Now, that's been a conundrum that has been thought about or talked about quite a bit, and when the state was funding a lot of these projects, that made some sense. But now that the state isn't necessarily funding these projects, should the state be seeing that benefit, or should that benefit somehow aggregate to the community or whoever's investing in that project? So these are really interesting policy questions, and Chris is the one that we count on to be really thinking about how we can solve some of those problems.
Any other questions?
We're about there, unless there's one last burning question. Otherwise, we can just wrap it up. Yeah, well, thank you everybody for coming down tonight. Remember, November 7th, we'll be back here up on the 4th floor talking about the electric grid, and November 5th, if you're not in Fairbanks, tune in online and we'll be doing a good conversation up there on the 5th. And yeah, thanks for coming. Thank you to the panelists and our sponsors. Yeah.